What happens when your own brother spends years calling you a failure, only for the IRS to reveal you as his biggest creditor? That question has been echoing in my mind ever since I opened that certified letter 3 months ago, the one that changed everything between my brother and me forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cassandra Vale, and for 28 years, I've lived in the shadow of my older brother, Damien. We grew up in the small mountain town of Pine Ridge, Colorado, where everyone knew everyone's business, and unfortunately, everyone knew that Damien Vale was the golden child, while his younger sister was, well, let's just say I wasn't winning any popularity contests. Damien had always been everything I wasn't. Tall, where I was average height; charismatic, where I was quiet; successful, where I was struggling. He was the star quarterback in high school, the one who got a full scholarship to Boulder, the one who came back to Pine Ridge 5 years ago and opened his own construction company, Vale Associates. The company that everyone in town talked about, the one that employed half the local workforce, the one that made Damien the unofficial king of our little mountain community. Me? I was the sister who barely graduated college, who bounced between odd jobs for years, who lived in a tiny studio apartment above Meredith's Diner on the wrong side of Main Street. I was the one people whispered about at the grocery store, shaking their heads with that look of pity mixed with judgment. Poor Cassandra. Such a shame she didn't turn out like her brother. But what they didn't know, what nobody in Pine Ridge knew, was that for the past 6 years, I'd been quietly building something of my own. While everyone was busy watching Damien's flashy success, I'd been working as a freelance financial consultant, helping small businesses across Colorado manage their books, optimize their tax strategies, and navigate complex financial waters. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly wasn't the kind of thing that got you featured in the Pine Ridge Gazette's local success stories column like Damien's construction company did every few months. The irony was delicious in the most bitter way possible. While my brother was busy calling me a loser at every family gathering, every chance encounter at Miller's hardware store, every awkward run-in at the annual Pine Ridge Harvest Festival, I was actually making more money than he was. But I kept quiet about it. Call it pride, call it stubbornness, or call it the deep-seated need to prove myself, without having to justify my worth to anyone. I lived modestly, drove my reliable but unremarkable Honda Civic, and let everyone believe what they wanted to believe about struggling little Cassandra. The breaking point came 6 months ago at our cousin Lily's wedding reception at the Pine Ridge Community Center. The whole family was there. Aunts, uncles, cousins from 3 counties over, all gathered under those terrible fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly green. I was sitting at the singles table, naturally, picking at the rubber chicken and trying to blend into the background when Damien approached with his usual swagger. He'd been drinking, his face flushed red from the combination of alcohol and his own inflated ego. Behind him trailed his usual entourage of admirers, local business owners who hung on his every word hoping for construction contracts, and various townspeople who treated him like some kind of celebrity. Well, if it isn't my little sister," he announced loudly enough for half the reception to hear. The conversation around us died down as people turned to watch. In Pine Ridge, any family drama was premium entertainment. Still living above that diner, Cass? Still playing around with those little bookkeeping jobs? I felt my face burn with embarrassment, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm doing fine, Damien." "Fine," he laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that cut through a room like a knife. "Come on, sis. We both know fine is just another word for failure. Look at you, 28 years old, no husband, no house, no real career. While I'm out here employing half the town, you're what? Helping Mrs. Peterson balance her craft store's checkbook?" The silence around us was deafening. I could feel every eye in the room on me, could practically hear the gossip mill starting to churn. This would be the story people told for months, how Damien Vale publicly humiliated his loser sister at Lily's wedding reception. But here's what Damien didn't know, what none of them knew. 3 weeks earlier, I had received a very interesting phone call from a potential client. A construction company in Denver was looking for someone to help them with a complex audit situation. They had heard about my work through a referral, and they were willing to pay premium rates for discreet, expert assistance. The company was Vale Associates. They didn't know I was Damien's sister. I'd been using my middle name, Reed, professionally for years to avoid exactly this kind of connection. To them, I was just C. Reed, the financial consultant with an impeccable track record and a talent for untangling messy books. As I sat there listening to my brother mock my little bookkeeping jobs, I was already 3 weeks into discovering just how catastrophically mismanaged his supposedly successful business really was. The books were a disaster. Tax obligations had been ignored or miscalculated for years. There were discrepancies that would make an accountant weep, and cash flow problems that he'd been covering up with increasingly creative financing. But the real kicker, the thing that made me smile slightly as he continued his public humiliation, was what I'd discovered just that morning. Hidden in the labyrinth of poorly organized financial records was a series of loans that Damien had completely forgotten about. Loans that had been personally guaranteed by him, loans that were now in default, loans that traced back to a series of shell companies and investment schemes. And according to the paperwork I'd found, the primary creditor on those loans wasn't a bank or a financial institution. It was me. 3 years ago, Damien had unknowingly borrowed money from an investment fund that I'd quietly established. He'd been so desperate for capital to expand his business, so convinced of his own success, that he'd signed papers without reading them carefully. My name wasn't anywhere obvious. It was buried in corporate structures and legal entities that would take a forensic accountant to unravel. But the IRS, as I was about to discover, employed very good forensic accountants. As Damien finished his little speech about my failures and the crowd began to murmur and disperse, I simply smiled and said, "You're absolutely right, Damien. I really should aim higher." I had no idea that within 3 months, those words would prove to be the most prophetic thing I had ever said. Because sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor, and sometimes the IRS delivers justice in ways you never expect. The story of how my brother went from calling me a loser to discovering I was his primary creditor is one of patience, strategy, and the kind of poetic justice that makes you believe in karma. But it all started that night at Lily's wedding, in that moment when I realized that silence wasn't just golden. It was about to become very, very expensive for Damien Vale. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 months after Lily's wedding. I was sitting in my small office above the diner, sipping coffee from my favorite chipped mug and reviewing quarterly reports for a client in Aspen, when I heard the commotion outside. Through my window, I could see a black sedan with government plates parked directly in front of Vale Associates across the street. 2 people in dark suits were walking toward Damien's office, carrying briefcases and that unmistakable air of federal authority that makes even innocent people nervous. I watched them as they disappeared into the building, and I'll admit, a small part of me felt a flutter of curiosity. But in town like Pine Ridge, federal agents showing up anywhere was bigger news than the annual elk migration. But I had work to do, so I turned back to my computer and tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "C. Reed Financial Consulting?" I answered, using my professional voice. "This is Agent Patricia Hoffman with the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division." The voice was crisp, efficient, and absolutely terrifying. "We need to speak with you immediately regarding your business relationship with Vale Associates Construction." My blood turned to ice water. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division didn't call to chat about tax tips. They called when someone was in serious, potentially criminal trouble.
What kind of business relationship? I managed to stammer. Ma'am, we'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can you come to our temporary field office? We're currently set up at Vale Associates on Main Street. The irony would have been hilarious if I wasn't terrified. They wanted me to come to my brother's office to discuss my connection to my brother's company, and they had no idea we were related. "I'll be right there," I said. I hung up the phone and sat there for a full minute, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. What had Damien done? More importantly, how was I connected to it? I'd been so careful to keep my consulting work separate from his business to maintain professional boundaries despite the family connection. But then I remembered the loan documents I'd found in his files, the ones that traced back to my investment fund, the ones that made him his primary creditor on paper. My stomach dropped when the pieces began falling into place. I grabbed my purse and practically ran down the stairs, through the diner's kitchen where Meredith was prepping for the lunch rush, and out onto Main Street. The walk to Damien's office had never felt longer, even though it was literally just across the street. The front door of Vale Associates was propped open, and I could hear voices coming from the conference room in the back. As I approached the reception desk, a young woman in a federal badge looked up at me with the kind of professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Cassandra Reed?" she asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Agent Hoffman will see you now, right this way." She led me past the familiar hallway lined with photos of Damien's construction projects. The new library, the expanded community center, the luxury homes he'd built for wealthy Denver transplants. Each photo seemed to mock me as I walked by, reminders of the success story that apparently wasn't quite what it seemed. The conference room was a disaster zone. Papers were spread across every surface, file boxes were stacked in corners, and 2 federal agents sat behind a mountain of documents that I recognized as financial records. Damien was nowhere to be seen. Agent Hoffman was a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her partner, Agent Rodriguez, was younger but had the same predatory focus of someone who made a living catching people in lies. "Ms. Reed," Agent Hoffman began, gesturing to a chair across from them. "Thank you for coming in. We're conducting a comprehensive audit of Vale Associates construction, and your name has come up repeatedly in our investigation." My name? I tried to sound confused, which wasn't difficult since I was genuinely terrified. "According to our records, you're listed as the primary creditor on several significant loans made to this company, loans totaling approximately $2.3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known about the loans, but I hadn't realized how much they had grown with interest and penalties over the years. $2.3 million. That wasn't just money. That was life-changing, business-destroying, potentially criminal amounts of money. "I think there might be some mistake," I said weakly. Agent Rodriguez slid a thick folder across the table. "These are copies of loan agreements, signed and notarized, showing transfers of funds from something called Mountain Vista Investment Holdings to Vale Associates Construction. According to Colorado State records, you're the sole owner of Mountain Vista Investment Holdings." I opened the folder with trembling hands. There it was, in black and white. My signature on documents establishing the investment company, Damien's signature on loan agreements, bank records showing the transfer of funds, a paper trail that connected me to my brother's business in ways that even I hadn't fully understood. "Ms. Reed," Agent Hoffman continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "we need to understand the nature of your relationship with Mr. Damien Vale. Are you business partners, family members? How did these loan arrangements come about?" This was it, the moment where I had to decide whether to reveal the family connection, whether to explain the complicated web of secrets and silent resentment that had led to this moment, the moment where I had to choose between protecting myself and potentially destroying my brother. But before I could answer, the conference room door burst open. Damien stood in the doorway, his face red with fury and what looked like panic. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his eyes had the wild look of a man whose world was collapsing around him. "Cassandra?" he said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" The two agents looked between us with the sharp interest of predators who just scented blood. "You two know each other?" Agent Hoffman asked. I looked at my brother, this man who had spent years calling me a failure, who had humiliated me in front of our entire family just 3 months ago, who was now staring at me like a ghost who had come to haunt him. And for the first time in my life, I realized I held all the cards. "Yes," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "He's my brother." The silence that followed my admission stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Agent Hoffman's pen hovered over her notepad, Agent Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair, and Damien stood frozen in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights. "Your brother," Agent Hoffman repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "Mr. Vale, you failed to mention that your primary creditor is a family member." Damien's mouth opened and closed without sound. For a man who had built his reputation on smooth talking and confident charm, he looked remarkably like a fish gasping for air. The color drained from his face as the implications began to sink in. I didn't know," he stammered. "I had no idea that C. Reed was... Cassandra uses her middle name professionally, and I never... We don't really discuss business. You borrowed $2.3 million, and you didn't know who you borrowed it from?" Agent Rodriguez interjected. The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I watched my brother's face cycle through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, horror, and finally, something that looked almost like betrayal. As if I had somehow wronged him by existing in his financial disaster. "Cassandra," Damien said, his voice taking on that familiar, condescending tone he'd used my entire life. "What the hell is going on here? What are these people talking about? Since when do you have millions of dollars to loan anyone?" And there it was. Even faced with federal agents and a criminal investigation, even caught red-handed in financial impropriety, my brother's first instinct was still to dismiss me, to assume that somehow this was all a mistake because little sister Cassandra couldn't possibly be successful enough to be a major creditor. Something inside me snapped. "Since when do I have millions of dollars?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Since I've been working my ass off for the past 6 years building a business, while you've been calling me a loser at every family gathering. Since I've been quietly managing money and investments while you've been telling everyone who'll listen that I'm a failure living above a diner." Agent Hoffman cleared her throat pointedly. "Perhaps we should focus on the financial arrangements." "No," I said, cutting her off. The word came out sharper than I intended, but I was beyond caring about professional decorum. "You want to understand the nature of our relationship? Here it is." I stood up from my chair, my hands trembling with 6 years of suppressed anger and frustration. My brother has spent our entire adult lives making sure everyone in this town knows that I'm the family disappointment. The sister who couldn't measure up, who couldn't find a husband, who couldn't build a real career. 3 months ago, at our cousin's wedding, he stood up in front of our entire family and called me a failure, made jokes about my little bookkeeping jobs, acted like I was some kind of charity case because I live modestly. Damien's face was turning red. "Cassandra, this isn't the time." "When is the time, Damien?" I shot back. "When have you ever thought it was the right time to treat me with basic respect? When have you ever bothered to actually ask what I do for work instead of just assuming I'm unsuccessful because I don't drive a fancy truck or live in a McMansion?" Agent Rodriguez was taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across the page. Agent Hoffman watched the exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a car crash in slow motion. "You want to know how these loans happened?" I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. 3 years ago, your company was hemorrhaging money. You'd overextended on projects, mismanaged your cash flow, and made promises you couldn't keep. You needed capital desperately, so you started looking for private investors. My investment company, Mountain Vista Holdings, was one of several that your finance guy approached. "Your investment company?" Damien's voice cracked. What investment company? You live above a diner. I live above a diner by choice because I don't need to prove my worth with expensive cars and oversized houses. Because I'd rather save my money and invest it wisely than blow it on status symbols to impress people who wouldn't help me if I was drowning. I could see the exact moment when the reality hit him. His eyes widened, his mouth fell open, and he actually took a step backward, as if the truth was a physical force pushing him away. You mean, all this time, when you were living in that tiny apartment, eating at the diner every night, driving that old Honda, you were rich? I was building wealth, I corrected. There's a difference. I was being smart with my money instead of flashy. I was investing in my future instead of my ego. And yes, part of those investments included loaning money to local businesses through my fund, including yours. Agent Hoffman chose that moment to interject again. Ms. Reed, for the record, did your brother know that Mountain Vista Holdings was your company when he applied for these loans? No, I said, not taking my eyes off Damien. The loan applications went through intermediaries. His financial advisor dealt with my attorney. Everything was properly structured and legal. I specifically used my middle name and corporate entities to avoid exactly this kind of personal conflict. But you knew, Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper. You knew you were loaning money to my company? Yes, I knew. And you didn't tell me. Why would I tell you? The question came out colder than I intended, but I was past the point of softening my words. So you could make fun of me for thinking I was successful enough to be your creditor? So you could find new ways to minimize my accomplishments? Or maybe so you could assume that family money came with family discounts and special treatment.
The silence that followed was deafening. Through the conference room windows, I could see people gathering on the sidewalk outside, drawn by the government cars and the gossip that traveled at light speed through Pine Ridge. By tonight, everyone in town would know that the IRS was investigating Vale Associates. By tomorrow, they'd probably know about the family connection, too. Mr. Vale, Agent Rodriguez said, his voice cutting through the tension, we need to understand why these loans are currently in default. According to our records, no payments have been made in over 14 months. Damien slumped into a chair, his head falling into his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. I didn't know how to contact the creditor. Every time I tried to make payments, they were returned. The account information kept changing. I thought maybe the company had gone out of business or something. I almost laughed. Almost. The payments were returned because you were 3 months behind when you tried to send them. The loan agreement clearly states that once you're in default, all communications have to go through legal channels. My attorney has been trying to contact you for over a year. Your attorney? Harold Steinberg from the law firm in Denver. He sent 17 letters to your business address. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Damien's face went white. We've been having problems with mail delivery. The post office box got mixed up and, oh God, this is really happening. Agent Hoffman closed her notepad with a sharp snap. Mr. Vale, Ms. Reed, we're going to need both of you to come to our Denver office tomorrow morning for formal interviews. This investigation is just beginning, and we need complete financial records from both parties. As the agents began gathering their papers, Damien looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or dismissal or condescension. It was something that looked almost like respect, mixed with fear and a dawning realization of just how completely his world was about to change. Cassandra, how much trouble am I in? For the first time in my life, my brother was asking me for help instead of offering criticism. For the first time, he was looking at me like I might actually know something worth knowing. And for the first time, I held his future in my hands. It depends on whether you're finally ready to treat me like family instead of hired help.
I walked out of that conference room and straight into the sharp October air, my mind already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the building. The crowd that had gathered on Main Street parted as I emerged from Vale Associates, their curious stares following me as I crossed back to my apartment. I could practically feel the gossip mill grinding into overdrive behind me. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care what Pine Ridge thought about me, because while everyone else was focused on the spectacle of federal agents and family drama, I was calculating, and the numbers in my head were telling a very interesting story. Back in my small office, I locked the door and pulled out my secure laptop, the one I used for sensitive client work. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as I accessed files that I hadn't looked at in months. Files that contained the complete financial picture of my relationship with Vale and Associates. The loan documents were just the beginning. Over the past 3 years, through various corporate entities and investment vehicles, I had become entangled in Damien's business in ways that I even hadn't fully realized. What had started as a single loan had evolved into a complex web of financial obligations, promissory notes, and secured debts. My brother didn't just owe me money, he owed me his entire business. I pulled up the corporate filings for Vale and Associates and cross-referenced them with my investment records. The picture that emerged was both worse and better than I had imagined. Worse because Damien's financial situation was a complete disaster. Better because I was in a position to control exactly how that disaster played out. The business was technically insolvent. Without my loans, it would have folded 18 months ago. Every major asset, the equipment, the fleet of trucks, even the building we'd just left, was pledged as collateral against debts that ultimately traced back to me. On paper, I didn't just hold the majority of his debt. I could foreclose on his entire operation tomorrow if I wanted to. But here's what made the situation truly remarkable. Damien had no idea. His financial advisor had structured the deals to obscure the connections, possibly to protect client confidentiality and avoid conflicts of interest. My brother had been running his business for 3 years without realizing that his biggest critic was also his biggest creditor. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt orchestrated by some cosmic force with a twisted sense of humor. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a small smile. For years, I had watched Damien strut around Pine Ridge like he owned the place, dismissing my accomplishments and treating me like the family failure. Now, I literally owned his place, or at least, I owned the debt that controlled it. But owning the debt was just the beginning. The real question was what to do with that power. I could foreclose immediately, take over the business, liquidate the assets, collect what I was owed, and walk away. It would be clean, legal, and financially sound. It would also destroy my brother's reputation, eliminate dozens of local jobs, and probably devastate the Pine Ridge economy. Vale & Associates wasn't just a construction company. It was a significant employer in a town that didn't have many options. Or I could work with him, restructure the debt, establish new payment terms, maybe even take an active role in turning the business around. It would be complicated and risky, but it might be profitable in the long run. And it would definitely put me in a position of permanent authority over my brother's professional life. Or, and this was the option that was beginning to appeal to me more and more, I could let him squirm for a while. I opened a new document on my computer and began typing. Not a legal filing or a financial analysis, but a strategic plan. A careful, methodical approach to extracting maximum value from this situation. Not just financial value, but something much more precious. Justice. For the next 3 hours, I worked with the focused intensity that had built my consulting business from nothing into a 7-figure operation. I mapped out every debt, every asset, every legal obligation that connected my brother's business to my investments. I researched bankruptcy law, foreclosure procedures, and IRS audit protocols. I calculated timelines, payment schedules, and liquidation values.
By the time the sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains, I had created a comprehensive plan that would give me complete control over Damien's financial future while keeping me firmly within legal boundaries. But owning the debt was just the beginning. The real question was what to do with that power. My phone buzzed with a text message. Damien, we need to talk. Can you come to my house tonight? I stared at the message for a long moment. The old Cassandra would have immediately said yes, would have rushed over to help clean up whatever mess he'd created, would have put family obligations ahead of her own interests. But the old Cassandra had never held $2.3 million worth of leverage over her brother's future. I typed back, I will be available tomorrow after the IRS interview. We can meet then. His response came immediately. This can't wait. My lawyer wants to discuss options for resolving this before tomorrow. His lawyer. Of course he had already called his lawyer. Probably the same expensive attorney who had helped structure some of the deals that got him into this mess in the first place. The same lawyer who would undoubtedly advise him to pressure me into accepting a settlement that favored him over me. I deleted my draft response and typed a new one. I have my own legal counsel. Any discussions about debt resolution should go through proper channels. That wasn't technically true yet, but it would be by morning. Harold Steinberg, the attorney who had been handling my investment company's legal affairs, was going to get a very interesting phone call first thing tomorrow. My phone rang immediately. Damien's name appeared on the screen, and I could practically feel his desperation radiating through the device. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. And again. On the fourth call, I finally answered. What, Damien? Cassandra, please, we're family. We can work this out between us without getting lawyers involved. I just need to understand what you want. What I want. The question that had been lurking in the back of my mind all afternoon, the one I hadn't quite been ready to answer until this moment. What I want, I said slowly, is for you to understand that this isn't a family matter anymore. This is a business matter. You borrowed money from my company, you defaulted on the loan, and now you're being audited by the IRS. What I want is for you to treat the situation with the seriousness it deserves. But surely we can discuss this after tomorrow's interviews. Until then, I suggest you spend your time gathering your financial records and preparing to answer some very difficult questions about how you've been managing your business. I hung up before he could respond. As darkness settled over Pine Ridge, I sat in my small office above the diner and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete control. Not just over my own life, but over the circumstances that had shaped my relationship with my brother for decades. Tomorrow, we would both walk into that IRS office in Denver. Damien would walk in as a businessman facing a potentially criminal investigation, desperate for help and scrambling to save his reputation. I would walk in as a legitimate creditor with meticulously organized records and a clear understanding of my legal rights. The power dynamic that had defined our entire relationship was about to be permanently reversed. And this time, I was going to make sure that reversal stuck. I opened my laptop one more time and began drafting an email to Harold Steinberg. By morning, I would have the best financial attorney in Colorado on retainer. By tomorrow afternoon, I would have a comprehensive legal strategy for protecting my interests while maximizing my leverage over my brother's situation. Damien had spent years treating me like I was too naive and unsuccessful to understand real business. Tomorrow, he was going to discover just how much I had learned about the intersection of money, power, and family loyalty. And he was going to learn it the hard way. The IRS field office in Denver occupied 3 floors of a gray concrete building that looked like it had been designed to crush hope on contact. At 8:47 a.m., I walked through the security checkpoint with Harold Steinberg at my side, both of us carrying identical black briefcases filled with meticulously organized documentation. Harold was exactly what you'd expect from an attorney who charged $800 an hour, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and possessing the kind of quiet confidence that came from winning battles in courtrooms across Colorado for the past 30 years. When I'd called him at 6 a.m., he'd listened to my situation with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a particularly interesting case. "This is remarkable," he'd said after I finished explaining. "Your brother essentially pledged his entire business as collateral to creditors he didn't know he was related to. The legal implications are fascinating." Fascinating. That was one word for it. We arrived at conference room C on the 4th floor to find Damien already seated at a long table, flanked by his attorney, James Morrison. Morrison was a local lawyer from Pine Ridge who specialized in real estate transactions and small business matters. He looked competent enough for handling construction contracts and property disputes, but sitting across from Harold Steinberg, he resembled a high school player who'd been called up to the major leagues. Damien's appearance shocked me. In less than 24 hours, my brother had aged what looked like 10 years. His usually perfect hair was unkempt, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he sipped coffee from a paper cup. When he saw me enter the room, something flickered across his face. Relief, hope, and underneath it all, a desperation that made my stomach clench with unexpected sympathy. Agent Hoffman and Agent Rodriguez were already seated at the head of the table, surrounded by file boxes and laptop computers. The formal setting made yesterday's confrontation in Pine Ridge seem almost casual by comparison. "Agent Hoffman, Agent Rodriguez, we appreciate parties who take these matters seriously." Harold placed his briefcase on the table with deliberate precision. "Agent Hoffman, Agent Rodriguez, my client is here voluntarily to provide any assistance possible in your investigation. We've prepared comprehensive documentation regarding all financial relationships between Miss Reed's investment entities and Vale Associates." The word entities was significant. Harold had spent 2 hours that morning reviewing my corporate structure, and what he'd found had impressed even him. Over the past 6 years, I'd created a sophisticated network of LLCs, investment funds, and holding companies that would have made a Wall Street firm proud. Everything was perfectly legal, expertly structured, and completely opaque to anyone who didn't have forensic accounting skills. Agent Rodriguez opened his laptop. "Let's start with the basics. Miss Reed, please explain how Mountain Vista Investment Holdings came to loan money to your brother's company." I glanced at Harold, who nodded slightly. We'd rehearsed this. "Mountain Vista is one of several investment vehicles I use to fund small businesses throughout Colorado. The loan to Vale Associates was processed through standard commercial channels. Mr. Vale's financial advisor submitted an application, we conducted due diligence, and terms were negotiated through intermediaries. At no point during the application process did I have direct contact with my brother regarding these transactions." "But you knew you were loaning money to his company?" "Yes, I was aware of the connection." "And you didn't disclose this to Mr. Vale?" Harold leaned forward slightly. "Agent Rodriguez, there's no legal requirement for a creditor to disclose family relationships to a borrower, particularly when the loan is processed through proper commercial channels. My client's investment decisions were based on standard business criteria." Damien's attorney, Morrison, looked uncomfortable. "Agents, surely the family relationship creates some kind of conflict of interest or disclosure requirement."
"Actually, it doesn't," Harold interrupted smoothly. "Miss Reed's investment company operates independently of her personal relationships. The loan terms offered to Vale and Associates were consistent with market rates and standard industry practices. The fact that the borrower happens to be her brother is legally irrelevant." I watched Agent Hoffman make notes. She was clearly trying to determine whether there was any criminal activity involved, any indication of fraud or conspiracy. What she was finding, I knew, was a perfectly legitimate business transaction between two parties who happened to be related. "Mr. Vale," Agent Rodriguez turned to my brother, "why did these loans go into default?" Damien's voice was barely above a whisper. "Cash flow problems? We had several large projects that ran over budget, and some clients were slow to pay. I thought I could catch up once a few invoices cleared, but then more problems developed. When did you first realize that your sister was the creditor on these loans? Yesterday, in your conference room. I had no idea. Agent Hoffman frowned. Mr. Vale, you borrowed $2.3 million without knowing who you borrowed it from? Morrison jumped in. My client dealt with the lender through proper intermediaries. The loans were arranged by his financial advisor through what appeared to be a legitimate investment firm. What appeared to be? Harold's voice carried just enough edge to make Morrison wince. Agent Hoffman, I object to any implication that my client's business operations are anything other than completely legitimate. Mountain Vista Investment Holdings is properly registered with the state of Colorado, maintains appropriate licenses, and operates in full compliance with federal and state banking regulations. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The moment when I had to make a choice that would define not just my relationship with my brother, but my relationship with my own conscience. I could play the victim, claim that I had been trying to help family and gotten taken advantage of, express shock and disappointment at my brother's financial mismanagement, position myself as another casualty of his poor business decisions. Or I could own the power I'd built. Agents, I said, my voice steady and clear, I'd like to clarify something about the nature of these loans. Harold shot me a warning look, but I ignored it. This was my decision to make. While the loans were processed through standard commercial channels, I want to be completely transparent about my motivations. I knew my brother's business was struggling. I knew he needed capital. And yes, I could have approached him directly about a family loan. I chose not to because I wanted these transactions to be conducted on purely business terms, without the complications that family relationships can create. Damien was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward with interest. Can you elaborate on that, Miss Reed? My brother and I have a complicated relationship. He's never taken my business acumen seriously. By structuring these loans through my investment company, I ensured that he would receive fair market terms without any family dynamics influencing the arrangement. I also protected both of us from the potential conflicts that could arise from mixing family and business. But now those conflicts exist anyway, Agent Hoffman observed. Now they exist because the loans are in default and under federal investigation, I corrected. The business relationship itself was clean. Harold was nodding approvingly. We'd discussed this approach: full transparency, complete cooperation, and absolute confidence in the legitimacy of all transactions. Morrison whispered something urgent in Damien's ear. My brother's face went pale as he listened, then looked across the table at me with something that might have been recognition or possibly fear. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes. Miss Reed, according to our analysis, the collateral pledged against these loans includes virtually all of Vale Associates' major assets. In the event of continued default, you would have the right to foreclose on the entire operation. That's correct. Have you considered exercising those rights? This was it, the point of no return, the moment where I publicly committed to a course of action that would define everything that happened next. I looked directly at my brother as I answered. I'm currently evaluating all available options with my legal counsel. My primary concern is recovering the money my company is owed. But I'm also aware that foreclosure would have significant impacts on the local economy and the employees who depend on Vale Associates for their livelihoods. Damien's eyes widened. He understood. For the first time in his life, he truly understood that his little sister held his entire future in her hands. The decision about how to proceed, I continued, will largely depend on Mr. Vale's willingness to work constructively toward a resolution that protects all parties' interests. Agent Hoffman closed her notepad. Well, this has been very illuminating. We'll need both parties to provide additional documentation over the next few weeks, but based on what we've seen today, this appears to be a civil matter rather than a criminal one. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Harold whispered in my ear, "Brilliantly handled.
You've just positioned yourself as the reasonable party while making it clear that you hold all the leverage.
But I wasn't thinking about leverage or legal strategy. I was thinking about the look on my brother's face when he realized that the sister he'd spent years calling a loser was now the only thing standing between him and complete financial ruin. Walking out of that federal building, I knew there was no going back. The old relationship where Damien dismissed me and I accepted it was over forever. From this moment forward, we would deal with each other as equals. Or he would lose everything. The choice was entirely his to make. The drive back to Pine Ridge from Denver was the longest 90 minutes of my life. Harold had offered to handle all future communications with Damien's legal team, the IRS, and anyone else who might get involved in what he cheerfully called this delicious mess. But the real work, the psychological warfare that was about to unfold, that was mine to orchestrate. I pulled into the parking space behind Meredith's diner at exactly 2:17 p.m. and sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, watching the familiar rhythm of small-town life through my windshield. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the post office with an armload of packages. Tom Bradley was washing the windows of his hardware store. Life in Pine Ridge was continuing exactly as it had for decades, completely unaware that the economic foundation of their little community was cracking beneath their feet. My phone had been buzzing constantly during the drive home. 17 missed calls from Damien, 4 from his attorney, Morrison, and a string of increasingly desperate text messages that ranged from pleading to angry to confused. I had read each one and responded to none. The silence was deliberate, calculated, and absolutely devastating. In the corporate world, I'd learned that silence was often more powerful than any negotiation tactic. Let the other party fill the void with their own fears and assumptions. Let them imagine worst-case scenarios while you maintained perfect calm. It was a strategy that had served me well with difficult clients, and it was about to serve me even better with my increasingly frantic brother. I climbed the stairs to my apartment and found a surprise waiting on my doorstep. A bottle of expensive bourbon with a handwritten note from Damien. "Cass, we need to talk. Please call me. This affects more than just us. D." The note revealed more than he probably intended. He was already thinking about the broader implications, the employees who might lose their jobs, the community impact of his potential business failure. Good. That meant he was beginning to understand the true scope of his situation. I unlocked my door, left the bourbon on the counter unopened, and tossed the note in the trash. Then I did something that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. I went about my normal routine as if nothing had changed. I made coffee, I reviewed client files, I answered emails from my real consulting business, the one that existed completely separate from my brother's drama. I updated spreadsheets, scheduled calls with prospective clients in Aspen and Vale, and drafted 2 proposals for new financial consulting contracts. The normalcy was intoxicating. For the first time in my adult life, I was living in a reality where my brother's opinion of me was completely irrelevant. He could think I was a loser all he wanted. The IRS documentation said otherwise. He could dismiss my business acumen. The $2.3 million he owed me spoke louder than his words ever could. Around 4 p.m., I heard a commotion on the street below. Through my window, I could see Damien's red pickup truck parked in front of Vale Associates, and a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. He was standing on the front steps of his office building, apparently trying to reassure his employees about something. I couldn't hear the words, but his body language screamed desperation. My phone rang. Damien again. I watched him through the window as I let it go to voicemail. He was pacing now, one hand running through his hair in the gesture I remembered from childhood when he was frustrated. Some things never changed. Except everything had changed. At 6 p.m., Meredith knocked on my door with a plate of her famous meatloaf and a look of concerned curiosity. "Honey, the whole town's buzzing about federal agents and investigations. People are saying Damien's in some kind of trouble and that you were involved somehow. Are you okay?" I accepted the plate with genuine gratitude. Meredith had been feeding me and looking out for me since I'd moved into the apartment above her diner.
She was one of the few people in Pine Ridge who had never made me feel like a disappointment. "I'm fine," I told her. "Just some complicated business matters getting sorted out." "Business matters," she repeated thoughtfully. "You know, I've always wondered what exactly you do up here all day. People in town think you just help folks with their taxes, but I've seen the kind of hours you keep, the phone calls at all times of day. That's not small-time bookkeeping." I smiled. Meredith was sharper than most people gave her credit for. "You're right. It's not." "Well," she said, patting my arm, "whatever's happening with your brother, just remember that family's important. But it's not more important than self-respect."
After she left, I sat by my window eating the meatloaf and watching the lights come on across Pine Ridge. The offices of Vale Associates were dark, the first time I could remember seeing that building empty before 8 p.m. on a weekday. Damien's house, visible on the hill above town, was blazing with lights, probably full of people offering advice, support, and opinions about how to handle his family situation. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Riley, Damien's daughter, who was away at college in Boulder. "Dad called me crying. Says you're trying to destroy his business? What's going on?" This was exactly what I had been expecting. Damien was mobilizing the family, trying to paint himself as the victim of his cruel sister's business machinations. He would tell them that I was being unreasonable, that families should stick together, that surely we could work something out without involving lawyers and federal investigations. I typed back, "Ask your dad to show you the loan documents he signed. Then ask him why he never told anyone in the family that his business was failing." Her response came quickly. "He says he didn't know you were the one who loaned him money." That's true. But he did know he was in default on $2.3 million. When exactly was he planning to mention that? The typing indicator showed she was crafting a response. Then it disappeared. Then it appeared again. Finally, "This is so messed up." Yes, it was, but not in the way she thought. Over the next 3 hours, I received calls from my Aunt Barbara, my Uncle Ted, and 2 more cousins. None of them reached me directly. I was screening every call now, but their voicemails told a story of a family in crisis mode. Damien was clearly working every family connection he had, trying to build pressure for me to be reasonable and work with him on a solution. The last voicemail of the evening came from my mother, calling from her retirement community in Arizona. Her voice was thin with worry and confusion. "Cassandra, honey, Damien called and said something about loans and federal investigations. He's very upset, and he says you're the only one who can help him. I don't understand what's happening, but surely you two can work this out like adults. Family is family, sweetheart. Please call me back." I saved the voicemail without responding. Tomorrow, I would call my mother and explain the situation calmly and factually. Tonight, I wanted Damien to sit with the consequences of his choices. At 11:47 p.m., as I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment. Heavy, familiar footsteps that I'd been listening to my entire life. Damien was coming to see me in person. The knock on my door was soft, almost hesitant. Nothing like the confident, demanding brother who had humiliated me at Lily's wedding just 3 months ago. "Cass, I know you're in there. Please, we need to talk." I stood perfectly still in my darkened living room, holding my breath. "I know you're angry. I know I've treated you badly. But this is bigger than just us now. I have 18 employees counting on me, families with mortgages and kids in college. Please don't let them pay for my mistakes." The manipulation was expertly done. Appeal to my conscience, make it about innocent people, position himself as the protector of the working class while casting me as the heartless creditor. If I hadn't spent 6 years building a business and learning to recognize every negotiation tactic in the book, it might have worked. "I'll do whatever you want," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I'll apologize publicly. I'll tell everyone how successful you are, how wrong I was about you.
Just please, can we talk about this face to face? I remained silent and motionless until I heard his footsteps retreating down the stairs. Through my window, I watched him sit in his truck for nearly 10 minutes before finally driving away. The silence I was maintaining wasn't just a negotiation strategy anymore, it was a statement. For 28 years, I had listened to his words, absorbed his criticism, accepted his version of reality. Now, it was his turn to listen to the silence and try to interpret what it meant. And judging by the 17 additional text messages that came in over the next hour, the silence was saying exactly what I wanted it to say. That the little sister he had spent years dismissing was now completely, utterly, and permanently beyond his control. By Thursday morning, Damien's desperation had escalated from pathetic to creative. I discovered this when I found my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, standing outside my apartment door with a concerned expression and a casserole dish. I took the dish with a polite smile, thanked Mrs. Chen, and closed my door. Inside the casserole dish was a folded piece of paper, a handwritten letter that was 3 pages long and reeked of desperation masked as contrition. The letter began with an apology that might have been meaningful if it hadn't been followed by 2.5 pages of emotional manipulation. Damien wrote about childhood memories, about how proud our parents had always been of both of us, about his employees' families and their Christmas bonuses that might not happen this year. He mentioned his daughter Riley's college tuition, the community center renovation project that his company was supposed to complete, and the economic impact his business failure would have on Pine Ridge. But the most revealing part was the final paragraph. I know I've been wrong about you, Cass. I know you're successful and smart and everything I never gave you credit for. I'm willing to make it right publicly. I'll tell everyone in town how wrong I was. I'll give you the recognition you deserve. Just please don't let this destroy everything I've built. I read the letter twice, then filed it in the growing folder I'd labeled Damien's Meltdown. Even his apology was transactional. He was offering to acknowledge my success as if it were a favor he could grant, rather than a reality that existed independent of his opinion. The morning brought more evidence of his increasingly frantic campaign. Harold called to inform me that Morrison had contacted him 3 times since Tuesday, each time with a different settlement proposal. The offers were escalating rapidly. First, a standard payment plan, then a restructured loan with higher interest rates, and finally a proposal that would give me a 40% equity stake in Vale Associates in exchange for debt forgiveness. He's panicking, Harold observed with the clinical detachment of someone who'd seen this scenario play out dozens of times. The 40% equity offer is actually quite generous, but I suspect he doesn't fully understand what he's proposing. If you accepted, you'd essentially become his business partner with significant control over operations. And what do you think I should do? From a purely financial perspective, let him sweat for another week. His offers are only going to get better as the pressure increases. From a strategic perspective, you're in the driver's seat. You can afford to be patient. Patience was exactly what I intended. But Damien, apparently, had other plans. Thursday afternoon brought what I would later refer to as the Parade of Pine Ridge Influencers. It started with Pastor Williams from the community church, who knocked on my door around 2 p.m. with a concerned smile and a Bible tucked under his arm. Cassandra, he said in the gentle voice he used for difficult pastoral conversations, I've been hearing about some family difficulties you and Damien are experiencing. I know these business matters can be complicated, but I wanted to remind you of the importance of forgiveness and family reconciliation. I invited him in for coffee and listened politely as he quoted scriptures about turning the other cheek and the bonds of brotherhood. What was interesting wasn't the religious counsel. Pastor Williams was genuinely well-meaning, but the fact that Damien had obviously briefed him on a very specific version of events. According to the pastor's understanding, I was an angry sister who was letting business disputes tear apart family relationships. Pastor Williams, I said when he finished his gentle sermon, did Damien mention that he borrowed $2.3 million and defaulted on the loan? His eyebrows rose slightly. He said there were some financial obligations that had become complicated due to family misunderstandings. Financial obligations. That's one way to put it. I pulled out my laptop and showed him the loan documents. These aren't family misunderstandings. These are legal contracts with specific terms that weren't met. Pastor Williams studied the documents with growing comprehension. I see. This is more complex than I was led to believe. It usually is. An hour later, Mayor Patricia Hendricks arrived with her official smile and her unofficial agenda. She was more direct than the pastor, but equally misinformed about the actual situation. Cassandra, I'll cut to the chase. Vale Associates employs 18 people directly and probably supports another dozen families indirectly through subcontractors and suppliers. If that business fails, it will devastate our local economy. I understand you're in a position to help resolve the situation. I'm in a position to collect money that's legally owed to me. The fact that my debtor is my brother doesn't change the fundamentals of the situation. But surely family considerations, Mayor Hendricks, I interrupted. When the city loans money for development projects, do you forgive those loans if the borrower is related to a city council member? Well, no, but then why would you expect me to operate under different standards? The mayor left looking frustrated and probably more sympathetic to my position than she had expected to be. The parade continued throughout the evening. Janet Morrison from the Chamber of Commerce stopped by to discuss community responsibility. Tom Bradley from the hardware store came to explain how much his business depended on Vale Associates projects. Even Dr. Sarah Nguyen, who had been my doctor since I moved to Pine Ridge, dropped by to suggest that stress can manifest in poor decision-making, and perhaps I should consider the long-term emotional costs of family conflict.
Each visitor had clearly been coached by Damien with the same basic script. I was an angry sister letting personal grievances override family loyalty and community responsibility. What none of them knew was that every conversation was actually strengthening my position, because each well-meaning intervention revealed just how little my brother understood about the legal and financial realities he was facing. The breaking point came Friday morning when I walked into Meredith Steiner for my usual breakfast and found the entire Pine Ridge Business Council sitting at the large corner table, clearly waiting for me. Meredith shot me an apologetic look as I entered. She'd obviously been asked to call when I came downstairs. The Business Council consisted of 5 local business owners who fancied themselves the unofficial economic leadership of Pine Ridge. They were led by Frank Garrison, who owned the largest ranch in the county and had the kind of old money arrogance that came with generational wealth. "Cassandra," Frank said, standing up with theatrical formality, "we'd like to speak with you about the situation with your brother's company." I ordered my usual coffee and eggs from Meredith, then turned to face the council with the kind of patient expression I'd perfected for dealing with difficult clients. "What situation would that be, Frank?" "Don't play games," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You know exactly what situation. Damien's told us about the loans and the federal investigation. He's also told us that you're the primary creditor and that you're refusing to work with him on a reasonable solution." "And what did he tell you about how those loans went into default?" The 5 men exchanged glances. Clearly, Damien's version of events had glossed over some key details. "Look," said Pete Morrison, James Morrison's older brother and owner of the auto repair shop, "we all know Damien can be challenging, but he's also employed half this town at one point or another. His business failing would hurt all of us. So your solution is for me to forgive millions of dollars in debt to protect the local economy?" "Your solution," Frank said, his voice hardening, "should be to remember that you're part of this community, that your family's reputation matters, that some things are more important than money." I sipped my coffee and looked around the table at 5 men who probably never took me seriously as a businesswoman, who certainly never invited me to join their business council, and who were now demanding that I sacrifice my financial interests to clean up a mess they couldn't solve themselves. "Gentlemen," I said, standing up and placing a $20 bill on the table for my breakfast, "I appreciate your concern for the local economy, but my brother's financial problems aren't a community crisis.
They're the predictable result of poor business management, and I'm not a charity organization. As I walked toward the door, Frank's voice followed me with barely contained anger. This isn't over, Cassandra. You can't hide behind lawyers and technicalities forever. This town has a long memory. I turned back to face him with the smile that I'd learned from Harold Steinberg, the kind of smile that conveyed absolute confidence in one's legal position. Mr. Garrison, I said, if you're threatening me, please do it clearly enough that I can quote you accurately to my attorney. If you're trying to intimidate me, you should know that I've been dealing with men who underestimate me my entire life. And if you're genuinely concerned about the local economy, perhaps you should ask my brother why he borrowed $2.3 million without telling anyone in the community that his business was failing. I left them sitting in stunned silence, probably wondering how the quiet little bookkeeper who lived above the diner had just demolished their entire intervention strategy. But the real victory wasn't the dramatic exit. The real victory was the realization that every pressure tactic Damien tried was only proving how desperate he'd become and how completely he'd underestimated the sister he'd spent years calling a loser. The unraveling began on Monday morning when I received a call from Harold that changed everything. His voice carried the barely contained excitement of a lawyer who just discovered a gold mine in his client's legal position. Cassandra, you need to see what just landed on my desk. The IRS audit has uncovered some fascinating additional information about your brother's business practices. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Harold's office in Denver, staring at documents that made my brother's situation infinitely worse than either of us had realized. The federal investigation hadn't just focused on the loans I'd made to Vale Associates. They'd conducted a comprehensive audit of the entire business, and what they'd found was a masterclass in financial negligence. Tax evasion, not the aggressive but legal kind that smart businesses engage in, the blatantly illegal kind that lands people in federal prison. Your brother has been underreporting income for at least 3 years.
The numbers were staggering. Vale Associates had been operating 2 sets of books, one that showed modest profits for tax purposes, and another that reflected the actual cash flowing through the business. The difference amounted to nearly $800,000 in unreported income over 3 years. It gets worse, Harold continued, producing another folder. He's been paying several employees under the table to avoid payroll taxes. The IRS has identified at least 6 workers who received cash payments that were never reported to the federal or state governments. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't just about loan defaults anymore. This was criminal activity that could result in serious jail time. But here's the truly remarkable part, Harold said, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration for the sheer audacity of what he was about to reveal. Your brother listed you as a business reference on multiple loan applications with other lenders, applications where he significantly misrepresented both his relationship to you and your role in his business. He handed me a stack of loan documents from 3 different banks. In each one, Damien had described me as his financial advisor and business partner, claiming that I helped manage his company's books and strategic planning. He'd even forged my signature on 2 documents that purported to show my approval of his expansion plans. This is fraud, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Multiple counts of fraud, actually. Bank fraud, tax fraud, and potentially wire fraud if any of these transactions cross state lines, which they did. Harold leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone who held an unbeatable hand. The IRS is recommending that the case be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The room seemed to spin around me. In the span of 1 week, my brother had gone from being an annoying family member to being a criminal defendant facing federal charges. And somehow, my name was attached to his crimes through forged documents and false representations. What does this mean for me? I asked. For you? This is actually excellent news. The federal prosecutors will need your cooperation as a witness, which puts you in an even stronger position regarding the civil debt. More importantly, these criminal charges mean that any pressure tactics your brother has been using against you, community intervention, family guilt trips, implied threats, are about to become completely irrelevant. Harold was right. Within hours of the criminal referral being made, the entire dynamic in Pine Ridge shifted like a seismic fault line adjusting to new pressure. The first sign came Tuesday afternoon, when I saw James Morris in his car parked outside his brother Pete's auto shop, followed by an animated conversation between the two men that ended with Pete shaking his head vigorously and walking away. By evening, word had somehow leaked that the IRS investigation had uncovered additional irregularities in Vale Associates' business practices. Wednesday brought a parade of Vale Associates employees to my door, but this time they weren't acting as Damien's messengers. They were scared workers trying to understand whether their jobs were legitimate, whether their tax withholdings had been properly submitted, and whether they might be implicated in whatever their boss had done. Maria Santos, Damien's office manager for the past 4 years, knocked on my door at 7 p.m. with tears in her eyes and a folder full of payroll documents. "Cassandra," she said, her voice shaking, "I need to show you something. I think Damien has been making me an accessory to tax fraud, and I don't know what to do." The documents Maria brought revealed the full scope of Damien's under-the-table payment scheme. She had been instructed to maintain 2 separate payroll systems, one that showed reduced hours for tax purposes, and another that tracked the actual cash payments to workers. She had assumed it was a temporary cash flow management strategy, but now she realized it was systematic tax evasion. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "At least 2 years, maybe longer. He told me it was just until the business got more stable that it was temporary." Maria wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I should have known better. I should have questioned it." "Maria, have you spoken to a lawyer?" "I can't afford a lawyer, and I can't lose my job. I have 2 kids and a mortgage. People are saying you might take over the business. Is that true? Could you keep us employed?" That night, I received similar visits from 3 more Vale Associates employees. Each brought evidence of Damien's questionable business practices, each expressed fear about their legal exposure, and each asked if I might be willing to save their jobs by taking control of the company. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The employees who had once looked down on me as the boss's unsuccessful sister were now seeing me as their potential savior from the criminal mess their actual boss had created. Thursday morning brought the most devastating blow yet to Damien's rapidly crumbling world. I was reviewing client emails when Harold called with news that sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge's business community.
The First National Bank of Pine Ridge has frozen all of Vale Associates' accounts pending resolution of the criminal investigation, he said. They've also called in the company's line of credit immediately. Your brother has approximately 48 hours to find alternative financing, or his business operations will cease entirely. I walked to my window and looked down at Main Street. Across the road, the Vale Associates office was dark, despite being the middle of a workday. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk outside, and I could see several of Damien's workers standing around looking confused and worried. My phone buzzed with a text from Riley. "Dad's in the hospital. Stress-induced chest pains. They're keeping him overnight for observation. This is killing him, Aunt Cass. Please." For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt a stab of genuine concern. Whatever else Damien was, arrogant, dismissive, financially reckless, he was still my brother. And whatever he'd done to deserve this situation, watching him have a medical emergency because of the stress wasn't something I could take satisfaction in. But before I could decide how to respond to Riley's message, my phone rang. It was Agent Hoffman from the IRS.
Ms. Reed, we need to schedule a follow-up interview regarding the forged documents that bear your signature. The U.S. Attorney's Office will want to discuss your potential role as a witness in the criminal case against your brother. When would you like to meet? Tomorrow morning, if possible. And Ms. Reed, you might want to prepare yourself for significant media attention. Cases involving family members, tax fraud, and this level of financial complexity tend to attract reporters. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment above the diner and tried to process what my life had become in the span of 8 days. A week ago, I was an anonymous financial consultant, living modestly in a small mountain town. Now I was about to become a key witness in a federal criminal case that would likely destroy my brother's business, eliminate dozens of local jobs, and potentially send Damien to prison. The strangest part was that I hadn't done anything except tell the truth and refuse to be manipulated by family guilt trips. Damien's downfall was entirely self-inflicted, the natural consequence of years of poor decisions, illegal shortcuts, and the arrogant assumption that rules didn't apply to him. As the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains, I realized that tomorrow would bring reporters, federal prosecutors, and probably more desperate attempts by Damien's supporters to convince me to save him from the consequences of his own actions. But tonight, for the first time in my adult life, I was the one with the power to decide how this story would end. And that feeling, despite everything else that was happening, was absolutely liberating. The media circus arrived in Pine Ridge at exactly 6:47 a.m. on Friday morning in the form of 3 news vans, 2 newspaper reporters, and a freelance blogger who specialized in small-town financial scandals. I watched from my window as they set up their equipment on Main Street, interviewing anyone willing to talk about the Vale Associates tax fraud case. By 8 a.m., my phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters who had somehow obtained my number. I let them all go to voicemail while I prepared for what I knew would be the most important day of this entire ordeal. Harold had arranged for me to meet with Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chang at 10 a.m., followed by a joint press conference where the federal prosecutors would officially announce the criminal charges against Damien. As a key witness and the victim of document fraud, I would be expected to make a brief statement about my cooperation with the investigation. "This is your moment," Harold had told me the night before. "You get to control the narrative publicly for the first time. Make it count." At 9:30, I walked out of my apartment building wearing my best business suit and found myself face-to-face with Channel 7 news reporter Amanda Mills, whose perfectly coiffed blonde hair and aggressive smile were already familiar from her coverage of Denver political scandals. "Ms. Reed, Amanda Mills, Channel 7 News. Can you comment on your brother's arrest this morning?" I stopped walking. His arrest? Damien Vale was taken into federal custody at 6 a.m. on charges of tax evasion, bank fraud, and wire fraud. Were you aware that the arrest was happening today? The world seemed to tilt slightly. Harold hadn't told me that Damien was being arrested this morning. The last I heard, he was in the hospital under observation. "I'm not prepared to comment at this time," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is it true that you're the primary creditor on over $2 million in defaulted loans to your brother's company?" "No comment. Sources tell us that your brother forged your signature on multiple bank documents. How does it feel to be both the victim and the key witness in your own brother's downfall?" The question hit like a physical blow. How did it feel? I'd been so focused on the legal and financial aspects of the situation that I hadn't really processed the emotional reality. My brother was being arrested. He would likely go to prison. Our family would never recover from this scandal. "I need to get to my meeting," I said, pushing past the reporter and her cameraman. But Amanda Mills wasn't finished. "Ms. Reed, community members are saying you could have prevented this by working with your brother on the debt issues. Do you feel any responsibility for the 18 families who will lose their jobs because of this investigation?" I turned around and faced the camera directly. For weeks, I'd been letting other people control the narrative about this situation. Damien had painted me as an unreasonable sister. The community leaders had portrayed me as selfish and vindictive. Even well-meaning friends had suggested that I should have done more to help my brother avoid this outcome. But none of them had been willing to acknowledge the truth, that this entire disaster was the result of Damien's choices, not mine. Ms. Mills, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed through years of managing difficult clients, the 18 families who may lose their jobs deserve to know that their employer has been stealing their tax withholdings for at least 2 years. They deserve to know that he forged my signature on bank documents without my knowledge or consent. And they deserve to know that the only reason this company stayed in business as long as it did was because of loans from my investment company, loans that I made in good faith and that were never repaid. The reporter's eyes lit up with the kind of predatory excitement that comes with unexpected good television. Are you saying your brother stole money from his own employees? I'm saying that the federal investigators found evidence of systematic tax fraud, including unreported payroll and cash payments that avoided federal tax obligations. The employees who worked for Vale Associates were as much victims of these crimes as anyone else. But surely family loyalty, I interrupted, doesn't include enabling criminal behavior or covering up financial fraud. My brother made choices that put his employees, his community, and his family at risk. I'm not responsible for those choices. Amanda Mills was furiously scribbling notes while her cameraman kept the camera rolling. Ms. Mills, what would you say to people who argue that you could have saved the business by forgiving the debt? This was the question I had been preparing for since the day this all started, the question that got to the heart of what this situation was really about. I would say that forgiving $2.3 million in debt to cover up criminal activity would make me an accessory to fraud. I would say that family loyalty that requires enabling criminal behavior isn't loyalty at all, it's codependence. And I would say that the community members who are angry at me for not cleaning up my brother's mess should ask themselves why they expect a woman they've spent years dismissing as unsuccessful to sacrifice her financial security to solve problems she didn't create. The words came out with a force and clarity that surprised even me. For the first time in my adult life, I was speaking my truth publicly without worrying about family harmony or community approval or anyone else's comfort level with reality. Amanda Mills looked slightly stunned. This clearly wasn't the defensive, apologetic response she had been expecting from the greedy sister her sources had probably described. Ms. Reed, do you have any message for your brother? I looked directly into the camera, knowing that this clip would probably be played on every news station in Colorado, and that Damien would almost certainly see it from whatever federal holding facility he was currently occupying. My message to Damien is the same message I would give to anyone facing the consequences of their own actions. Take responsibility, tell the truth, and stop expecting other people to pay for your mistakes. As I walked away from the camera crew and toward my car, I could hear Amanda Mills speaking into her microphone. That was Cassandra Reed, the sister and primary creditor of accused tax fraud defendant Damien Vale, speaking publicly for the first time about the scandal that has rocked this small Colorado community. The drive to Denver passed in a blur of mountain scenery and racing thoughts. I kept replaying my impromptu interview, wondering if I'd said too much or not enough, if I'd come across as sympathetic or vindictive, if I'd successfully defended my position or just provided more ammunition for my critics. But by the time I reached the federal building, I realized that it didn't matter how the interview was received. For the first time in my adult life, I had spoken my truth publicly without filtering it through concerns about family harmony or community approval or anyone else's comfort level with reality. The relief was intoxicating.
The meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chang was efficient and professional. She explained the charges against Damien, outlined my role as a witness, and prepared me for the questions I might face during the press conference. The federal case was strong. They had documents, bank records, and testimony from multiple employees. Damien's conviction was essentially a foregone conclusion. Ms. Reed,
Chang said as we prepared to face the media. "I want you to know that your cooperation has been invaluable to this investigation. Without your willingness to provide documentation and testimony, we might never have uncovered the full scope of the fraud." At 2 p.m., I stood behind a podium in the federal building's press room, facing a crowd of reporters and cameras that represented every major news outlet in Colorado. Assistant U.S. Attorney Chang announced the charges against Damien, outlined the evidence of systematic tax fraud, and explained the potential penalties he was facing. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my statement brief and factual. I am cooperating fully with federal investigators as both a witness to these crimes and a victim of document fraud. I want to emphasize that the hardworking employees of Vale Associates were victims of these crimes, not participants in them. I hope that justice will be served while protecting the innocent people who were harmed by this illegal activity. During the question period that followed, reporters asked about family relationships, community impact, and the future of the construction company. I answered each question with the same calm professionalism I used in business meetings, refusing to be drawn into emotional responses or defensive justifications. The final question came from a reporter I didn't recognize. "Ms. Reed, what's next for you personally? How do you move forward after something like this?" I looked out at the crowd of cameras and reporters, thinking about the small apartment above the diner where this all started, about the years of being dismissed and underestimated, about the moment when I realized I held more power than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. "What's next," I said, "is that I continue building the business I've worked 6 years to create. I continue serving my clients with integrity and professionalism, and I continue living my life without requiring anyone else's permission or approval to be successful." As I walked out of that press room, past the cameras and microphones and shouted questions, I realized that the scared little sister who had been afraid of family disapproval was gone forever. In her place was a woman who had learned to speak truth to power, even when that power was her own family. The letter arrived on Saturday morning, delivered by Riley herself. I watched from my window as Damien's daughter climbed the stairs to my apartment, her face streaked with tears and her shoulders shaking with exhaustion. She'd driven 4 hours from Boulder, apparently, to hand-deliver what she said was her father's final message to me. The envelope was thin, cream-colored paper that I recognized from the expensive stationery set our mother had given Damien for Christmas years ago. Inside was a single sheet with his familiar handwriting, but the confident strokes I remembered from childhood had been replaced by shaky, uncertain letters. "Cassandra," the letter began, "I am writing this from the Federal Detention Center in Denver, where I will likely remain until my sentencing hearing. My attorney tells me I should expect between 18 and 36 months in federal prison, depending on whether I cooperate with prosecutors and accept a plea agreement." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, Riley watching me with desperate hope as if my reaction to her father's letter might somehow change the outcome of this entire disaster. "I want you to know," Damien's letter continued, "that I understand now what I put you through, not just these past few weeks, but for years. I understand that I treated you like you were less than me, like your success didn't matter, like your opinions weren't worth hearing. I understand that I was wrong about who you are and what you've accomplished." The words were exactly what I'd wanted to hear from him my entire adult life: recognition, acknowledgement, respect. But reading them in a letter written from a jail cell, knowing they came only because he had lost everything and needed my help, felt hollow rather than satisfying. "Riley tells me that people in town are blaming you for what happened to my business, for the jobs that were lost, for my arrest. I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Every decision that led to this moment was mine. Every shortcut I took, every rule I bent, every lie I told, those were my choices. You didn't create this situation.
You just refuse to help me cover it up." I looked up at Riley, who was sitting on my couch with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying not to cry. "What does he want from me?" I asked quietly. "He wants you to read the whole letter, please."
I continued reading. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know that everything I'm facing is the result of my own actions, but I am asking anyway because I'm desperate and you're the only family I have left who might be able to help." Here it comes, I thought. The manipulation, the guilt trip, the final attempt to make his problems my responsibility. The federal prosecutors have offered me a plea agreement. If I cooperate fully with their investigation, provide complete documentation of all financial irregularities, and testify against my business partners who may have been involved in similar schemes, they will recommend the minimum sentence. But there's a catch. I felt my stomach clench with anticipation. Part of the plea agreement requires that I make full restitution to all victims of my crimes. That includes the IRS for unpaid taxes, the employees who had money stolen from their paychecks, the banks I defrauded, and you, for the $2.3 million I owe your investment company plus interest and legal fees. The number on paper, written in my brother's handwriting, was $3.1 million. More money than most people in Pine Ridge would see in their entire lifetimes. I don't have $3.1 million, Cassandra. I don't have $300,000. I have about $47,000 in assets that aren't already pledged as collateral to creditors. Everything else, the house, the business equipment, the vehicles, will be sold to pay restitution, but it won't be enough. Not even close. I could see where this was leading, and my chest tightened with familiar anger. The prosecutors have told me that if I can't make full restitution, they will not offer the plea agreement. Instead, they will pursue maximum penalties on all charges, which could mean up to 8 years in federal prison. They've also indicated that if major predators refuse to cooperate with restitution efforts, it suggests the crimes may have been more extensive than currently documented. There it was. The final manipulation. Accept less money, or be partially responsible for sending your brother to prison for 8 years instead of 2. But the letter wasn't finished. I am not asking you to forgive the debt, Cassandra. I'm not asking you to sacrifice your financial interests to save me from the consequences of my actions. What I'm asking is that you make whatever decision feels right to you, without worrying about what it means for me. I read that paragraph 3 times, certain I'd misunderstood something. For our entire lives, I've made you feel like your decisions were subject to my approval, like your success was dependent on my recognition. I've treated you like you owed me something, respect, accommodation, financial help, simply because I was your older brother. I was wrong about all of it. Riley was crying quietly now, tears falling onto her hands as she watched me read. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me financial salvation. You don't owe me anything except the truth in your testimony, which you've already provided. Whatever happens to me now is the result of choices I made, not choices you made. I looked up from the letter to find Riley staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not pleading or desperate, but something that looked almost like pride. You know what's funny, Riley said softly. He's more proud of you now than he's ever been, even sitting in jail, even facing 8 years in prison. He keeps talking about how impressed he is with what you built, how smart you were to structure your business the way you did, how you handled yourself with the reporters and the federal prosecutors. Riley, she interrupted, I'm not asking you to save him. He specifically told me not to ask you for that. I'm just telling you that he finally sees you the way you deserve to be seen all along. I finished reading the letter. I have one request, and it's not about money or plea agreements or prison sentences. I'm asking you to take care of yourself. Build the life you want without worrying about what our family thinks, what Pine Ridge thinks, or what anyone thinks.
You've earned the right to be proud of what you've accomplished, and you've earned the right to be free from people who don't appreciate what you're worth. The letter was signed simply, your brother, Damien. I set the letter down on my kitchen table and looked at Riley, this young woman who was about to watch her father go to federal prison, who had driven 4 hours to deliver a message that didn't ask for anything except my continued independence. "What will you do?" she asked. "About the plea agreement?" "About everything." I walked to my window and looked down Main Street where the news vans had finally departed and normal life was slowly resuming. The closure notice was already posted on the door of Vale Associates. The employees had filed for unemployment benefits. The community was beginning to adapt to the reality of life without their largest employer. "I'm going to call Harold," I said finally. "I'm going to have him negotiate a restitution agreement that allows your father to take the plea deal, but that also protects my financial interests." Riley's face lit up with hope.
"But I'm also going to make something clear," I continued. "This is a business decision based on what makes the most financial sense for my company. It's not about family loyalty or forgiveness or giving him a second chance he doesn't deserve. It's about recovering as much of my money as possible while minimizing legal complications." "I understand," Riley said. "And after this is resolved, after the trial, after the sentencing, after all the legal proceedings are finished, I'm done. No more family obligations to clean up messes I didn't create. No more guilt trips about what family members should do for each other. Your father and I will be creditor and debtor, nothing more." Riley nodded, tears still falling. "He said you'd probably say something like that. He said it's what you should say." That afternoon, I called Harold and instructed him to begin negotiations for a structured restitution plan that would allow Damien to accept the plea agreement while ensuring that my investment company recovered the maximum amount possible over time. It was a business decision made with business logic, and it would be documented with business-appropriate legal language. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that something had changed in the past 2 weeks that went deeper than money or legal proceedings or family dynamics. I had finally learned to make decisions based on my own interests rather than other people's expectations. And that education, painful as it had been, was worth far more than $3.1 million. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the newest branch of Mountain Vista Financial Services, watching my team of 4 junior consultants present quarterly results to our rapidly expanding client base. The office occupied the entire second floor of a renovated building in downtown Aspen, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over snow-capped peaks and a ski resort that catered to the kind of wealthy clients who needed sophisticated financial management. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent years hiding my success in a tiny apartment above a diner, while now I was running a legitimate financial services firm that employed 8 people and managed over $50 million in client assets. The woman who had once been dismissed as Pine Ridge's family failure was now featured on the cover of Colorado Business Magazine as one of the state's rising stars in financial services. The article, which came out 3 weeks after Damien's sentencing hearing, included a photograph of me standing in my new office and a headline that read, "From Small Town to Big Success, How Cassandra Reed Built a Financial Empire." The reporter had done her homework, documenting my journey from freelance bookkeeper to investment fund manager to full-service financial advisor. But what made the article particularly satisfying was a single paragraph near the end. Reed's success became national news earlier this year when her brother, Damien Vale, was sentenced to 24 months in federal prison for tax evasion and bank fraud. Reed, who was the primary creditor on loans to her brother's failed construction company, became a key witness in the federal prosecution. Family relationships don't exempt anyone from business responsibilities, Reed told prosecutors during the trial. Success requires accountability, and accountability doesn't stop at family boundaries. The quote had been picked up by financial blogs and business podcasts across the country. I'd received speaking invitations from 3 universities and 2 professional organizations who wanted me to discuss the intersection of family dynamics and business ethics.
Harvard Business School had even contacted me about developing a case study based on the Vale Associates investigation. My assistant, Jennifer Kim, knocked on the conference room door and gestured that I had an important call. I excused myself from the client meeting and walked to my private office, which was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that wealthy clients expected from their financial advisors. "Cassandra, it's Harold. I have some interesting news about the restitution payments." Harold's voice carried the satisfaction of a lawyer who had negotiated an exceptionally favorable outcome for his client. Over the past 6 months, he'd structured a restitution agreement that was making me money rather than costing me money. Damien's assets had been liquidated and distributed to creditors, but the bulk of my recovery was coming from his prison wages and a percentage of any future earnings for the next 15 years. "Damien has been working in the federal prison's accounting department," Harold continued. "Apparently, he's quite good with numbers when he's not using them to commit fraud. He's also been teaching financial literacy classes to other inmates. The warden says he's become something of a model prisoner." "That's good for him," I said, surprised to find that I genuinely meant it. "The interesting part is that he's been writing to you, monthly letters that he sends to my office instead of directly to you, respecting the communication boundaries you established. He's not asking for anything, just updating you on his restitution payments and his progress in prison programs."
I had made it clear through Harold that I didn't want direct contact with Damien during his incarceration, but knowing that he was actually working to pay back what he owed, that he was taking responsibility rather than wallowing in self-pity, gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. "Harold, what's the total recovered so far?" "Including asset liquidation, prison wages, and the percentage garnishment of his previous attorney's settlement fees, you've recovered $1.4 million of the original $3.1 million owed. At the current rate, you'll recover approximately 75% of the total debt over the next 10 years. It was more than I'd expected, and far more than I would have recovered if I'd simply written off the debt as a family obligation. The business decision to pursue legal remedies rather than emotional solutions had been vindicated in the most concrete way possible. "There's something else," Harold said. "I received a call from James Morrison, Damien's former attorney. He wants to hire Mountain Vista Financial Services to help him restructure his practice's finances. Apparently, he was quite impressed with how professionally you handled the entire situation." Morrison. The same lawyer who had tried to pressure me into family-based settlements, who had implied that my business approach was unnecessarily harsh, who had suggested that family loyalty should override legal contracts. Now he wanted to hire me because of the very professionalism he'd once criticized. "Schedule a consultation," I said. "Standard rates, standard contract terms, no family connections to complicate the relationship." After hanging up with Harold, I walked back to the conference room where my team was finishing their presentation. These 4 consultants, 3 women and 1 man, all in their 20s and 30s, represented everything I'd learned about building a business based on competence rather than connections, merit rather than family relationships, and professional standards rather than personal accommodations. Sarah Martinez, my senior consultant, was presenting projections for a new client acquisition strategy that would expand our services into estate planning and tax optimization. She'd been working on the analysis for weeks, and her recommendations were sophisticated, thorough, and absolutely brilliant. "Excellent work," I told her when the presentation concluded. "Let's implement Phase 1 next quarter." As the team gathered their materials and prepared to return to their offices, Sarah approached me with a question that caught me off guard. "Cassandra, I hope this isn't too personal, but I've been following your story in the business press. How did you handle the family pressure to compromise your professional standards? I'm dealing with something similar with my own relatives, and I could use some advice." I looked at this young woman who reminded me of myself 6 years ago, talented, ambitious, but struggling with the expectation that family relationships should take precedence over business principles. The question she was asking was one I'd been grappling with my entire adult life. "Sarah, the most important thing I learned is that enabling someone's bad behavior isn't the same as helping them.
When family members ask you to compromise your professional standards to bail them out of problems they created, they're not asking for help. They're asking you to become complicit in their poor decisions. She nodded thoughtfully. But how do you deal with the guilt? The accusations that you're being selfish or greedy? I said, you remember that guilt is often just manipulation disguised as an emotion. People who respect your boundaries don't try to make you feel guilty for having them, and people who call you selfish for refusing to enable their irresponsibility are usually the most selfish people in the relationship. That evening, I drove back to Pine Ridge for the first time since Damien's arrest. The trip wasn't sentimental. I was meeting with a potential client who owned several properties in the area and needed help with tax planning. But as I drove through the familiar streets of my hometown, I was struck by how much my relationship with the place had changed. The diner where I used to live was still there, though Meredith had renovated and expanded. Vale Associates' former office building had been purchased by a Denver real estate company and converted into luxury condos. The Pine Ridge Business Council, I'd heard, was actively recruiting new companies to replace the jobs that had been lost when Damien's business collapsed. I parked outside the community center where Lily's wedding reception had been held 9 months ago, the night when Damien had publicly humiliated me in front of our entire family. The building looked exactly the same, but I felt like a completely different person walking past it. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Saw your magazine cover at the grocery store. So proud of you, sweetheart. Hope you know we always believed in you. I stared at the message for a long moment. My mother's version of history was different from mine. I distinctly remember years of subtle suggestions that I should be more like Damien, more successful, more settled. But her pride now, however revisionist, was genuine. I typed back, "Thank you. Love you too." As I drove back to Aspen that night, past the mountain roads that had shaped my childhood and through the valleys where I'd spent years feeling like a failure, I realized that vindication wasn't just about other people finally recognizing my success. It was about recognizing it myself, without needing external validation to confirm what I'd known all along.
The woman who had been called a loser by her own brother was now running a multi-million-dollar business, employing talented professionals, and building something that would last long after family drama faded into memory. And the best part was that I'd done it all without compromising a single principle or enabling a single bad decision along the way. 1 year to the day after Damien called me a loser at Lily's wedding, I stood at the podium of the Denver Convention Center addressing an audience of 800 financial professionals at the Colorado Association of Business Advisors annual conference. My keynote speech was titled, "Family, Finance, and Professional Boundaries When Personal Relationships Complicate Business Decisions." Looking out at the sea of faces, accountants, financial planners, business consultants, and investment advisors, I realized that many of them had probably faced similar crossroads in their own careers, moments when family loyalty collided with professional ethics, when emotional manipulation masqueraded as love, when the pressure to enable destructive behavior was disguised as keeping the peace. 18 months ago, I began. I was living in a studio apartment above a diner, running a one-person consulting business, and listening to my brother publicly describe me as a failure. Today, I'm here to tell you about the most expensive education I ever received and why it was worth every penny. The audience laughed, but I could see the recognition in their eyes. Almost everyone in that room had a family member who'd asked them to bend professional rules, ignore ethical boundaries, or sacrifice their own interests for the sake of family harmony. The story I'm about to tell you isn't really about tax fraud or IRS investigations or family dysfunction. It's about the moment when you realize that protecting someone from the consequences of their actions isn't love, it's enablement. It's about learning the difference between helping someone and helping them avoid responsibility. I told them about the wedding reception, about the ultimatum disguised as an opportunity, about the years of living small to avoid threatening someone else's ego. I told them about the discovery that my brother owed me millions of dollars he couldn't repay, about the federal investigation that revealed systematic criminal activity, about the family and community pressure to be reasonable and forgive debt that was acquired through fraud. But more importantly, I told them about the choice every professional faces when personal relationships threaten to compromise professional standards. The hardest lesson I learned, I said, is that family loyalty isn't about saying yes to every request for help. Real loyalty means caring enough about someone to let them face the consequences of their choices. It means refusing to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal makes you the villain in their story. During the question and answer session that followed, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. Miss Reed, how do you handle the guilt? Even when you know you're making the right business decision, how do you deal with family members who make you feel like you're being heartless? It was the same question Sarah Martinez had asked me months earlier, and I'd been thinking about the answer ever since. Guilt, I said, is information. It tells you that you care about someone and that you don't want to cause them pain. But guilt becomes destructive when it's used as a weapon to manipulate your decisions. When someone consistently makes you feel guilty for having boundaries, for protecting your interests, or for refusing to clean up messes you didn't create, that's not love speaking, that's manipulation. A man in the middle section asked, "What would you say to someone who's currently facing pressure to bail out a family member's failing business?" I would say that the question isn't whether you love that family member enough to help them. The question is whether you love them enough to let them learn from their mistakes. Every time you rescue someone from consequences they earned, you teach them that their actions don't really matter because someone else will always clean up the mess. After the speech, I was surrounded by attendees who wanted to share their own stories. A tax accountant whose brother kept asking him to hide income, a financial planner whose sister wanted help evading alimony payments, a business consultant whose father expected free services because family should help family. Each conversation reinforced something I'd learned through my own experience. The people who demand special treatment because of family relationships are usually the same people who showed the least respect for family boundaries. That evening, I sat in my hotel room overlooking downtown Denver, reviewing the speech evaluations that conference organizers had collected. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, but one comment stood out. "Thank you for giving me permission to prioritize my professional integrity over family pressure. I've been struggling with this for years." Permission. That was what I'd been looking for my entire adult life. Permission to be successful without apologizing for it. Permission to set boundaries without justifying them. Permission to prioritize my own well-being without being labeled selfish. But the truth was that permission had always been mine to give myself. I just hadn't been confident enough to claim it.
My phone buzzed with a text from Harold. Damien was released on parole this morning. He's enrolled in a halfway house program in Colorado Springs and has a job lined up with a nonprofit organization that provides financial literacy training to low-income families. Thought you should know. I stared at the message for a long moment. Damien had served 14 months of his 24-month sentence, reduced for good behavior and participation in prison education programs. According to Harold's previous updates, he'd spent his incarceration learning about business ethics, personal accountability, and the legal obligations that come with financial responsibility. Part of me, a small part that I'd thought was gone forever, wondered if this experience had genuinely changed him, whether the brother who emerged from federal prison might be someone I could have a relationship with, whether redemption and reconciliation might be possible. But a larger part of me, the part that had learned to make decisions based on evidence rather than hope, knew that it didn't matter. The relationship we'd had before was gone forever, and any future relationship would have to be built on completely different foundations. Foundations of mutual respect, professional boundaries, and absolute accountability. I typed back to Harold. "Thank you for the update. Please maintain the existing communication protocols." 2 weeks later, I received an envelope addressed in Damien's handwriting, but forwarded through Harold's office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Cassandra, I started my new job this week, teaching financial responsibility to people who've made mistakes similar to mine. Every day, I explain to them the same lesson you taught me, that avoiding consequences doesn't solve problems, it creates bigger ones. Thank you for refusing to enable my irresponsibility. I'm finally learning to build something legitimate. D. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer, next to the magazine cover featuring my business and the speaking invitations from universities across the country. The collection represented a transformation that had begun with a moment of silence at a family wedding and culminated in the recognition that success doesn't require anyone's permission except your own. 6 months later, I opened the 4th location of Mountain Vista Financial Services, this time in Boulder, just 90 minutes from Pine Ridge, but representing a completely different world of possibility. The client base included tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers, and established business owners who needed the kind of sophisticated financial planning that I'd been providing for years to clients who respected both my expertise and my boundaries. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a reporter asked me about my plans for expansion and whether I'd ever considered returning to Pine Ridge to establish a local office. I've learned, I said, cutting the ribbon with a satisfied smile, that sometimes the best way to honor where you came from is to build something so much better that going back becomes unnecessary. That night, as I stood in my new office looking out at the lights of Boulder and the mountain peaks beyond, I thought about the question that had started this entire journey. What happens when your own brother spends years calling you a failure for the IRS to reveal you as his biggest creditor? The answer, I'd learned, wasn't about revenge or justice or family dynamics. It was about the moment you realize that other people's opinions of you, even family members' opinions, don't define your reality unless you let them. The woman who had once hidden her success in a studio apartment above a diner was now building something that would outlast any family drama, any small-town gossip, any attempt by others to diminish her accomplishments. And the best part was that she'd done it all without compromising a single principle, without enabling a single destructive decision, and without requiring anyone's permission to claim the success that had always been hers to build. Freedom, it turned out, wasn't about escaping your family or your past. It was about building a future so solid, so authentic, and so completely your own that nothing and no one could shake it. That was the lesson worth $2.3 million, and it was worth every penny. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.